threats of punishment in an afterlife, threats that were being made by the bishop to non-Christians, were to be believed, it would mean the death of science and philosophy, she taught. To rule by fettering the mind through fear of punishment in another world is just as base as to use force. Hubbard quotes Hypatia as saying, "Fables should be taught as fables, myths as myths, and miracles as poetic fancies. To teach superstitions as truth is the most terrible thing. The child mind accepts and believes them, and only through great pain and perhaps tragedy can he be in after years relieved of them. In fact, men will fight for a superstition quite as quickly as for a living truth, often more so. Since a superstition is so intangible, you cannot get at it or to refute it. But truth is a point of view, and so is changeable." As for Hypatia's teachings on Neoplatonism, according to Hubbard, she taught that Neoplatonism is a progressive philosophy and does not expect to state final conditions to humans whose minds are finite. Life is an unfoldment, and the further we travel, the more truth we can comprehend. To understand the things at our door is the best preparation for understanding those that lie beyond. Hypatia placed Plotinus in his ability to see the good in all things ahead of Plato. But even then, had there been no Plato, she taught, there would have been no Plotinus. Although Plotinus surpassed Plato, yet it is plain that Plato, the inspirer of him and so many more, is the one man whom philosophy cannot spare. Out of the labyrinth of history and speculation, Plotinus returned to Plato as a basis or starting point for all the truths which humans can comprehend. Plotinus believed in all religions, but had absolute faith in none. Who then were Hypatia's students? They were mainly students from wealthy and influential families who came to Alexandria to study with her. Many of these latter attained high posts in government and the church. One of Hypatia's students at the Neoplatonist school of Alexandria was Synesius of Cyrene, who became bishop of Ptolemais in 410. Much of the extant information we have on Hypatia comes by way of Synesius and his pupil, the Neoplatonist philosopher Damasius. Here is a quote from Damasius from the Suda, a 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia. "Hypatia was born and raised and educated in Alexandria. Having a nobler nature than her father's, she was not satisfied with his mathematical instruction, but she also embraced the rest of philosophy with diligence. Putting on the white philosopher's cloak and the laurel wreath of the scholar, although a woman, and advancing through the middle of the city, she explained publicly to those who wished to hear about either Plato or Aristotle or any of the other philosophers. In addition to her teaching, she attained the height of practical virtue, becoming just and prudent." The 5th century Christian historian Socrates Scholasticus, not the famous Athenian philosopher Socrates, wrote, "There was a woman at Alexandria named Hypatia, daughter of the philosopher Theon, who made such attainments in literature and science as to far surpass all the philosophers of her own time. Having succeeded to the school of Plato and Plotinus, she explained the principles of philosophy to her auditors, many of whom came from a distance to receive her instructions. On account of the self-possession and ease of manner which she had acquired in consequence of the cultivation of her mind, She not infrequently appeared in public in the presence of the magistrates. Neither did she feel abashed in going to an assembly of men, for all men, on account of her extraordinary dignity and virtue, admired her the more. It has been pointed out by some philosophers that there exists an affinity between Neoplatonic philosophy and mathematics. Both emphasize form rather than substance. Both concern universals rather than particulars. And both concern ideas abstracted from the natural or pragmatic world. As for what is known of Hypatia's work in mathematics, I glean the following information from 2 articles by mathematicians A.W. Richardson and Michael A.B. Deacon in the book Sherlock Holmes in Babylon and Other Tales of Mathematical History. We know that Hypatia edited her father's commentary on Euclid's Elements. Of her own writing in mathematics, only 3 are known to have existed. A commentary on the 13-volume book Arithmetica by the mathematician Diophantus, a commentary on the book by Apollonius about the mathematics of curves called conic sections, the ellipse and the hyperbola, and a commentary on the astronomical canon of the famous astronomer Ptolemy. Some interpolations, evidently from Hypatia's hand, remain in the surviving mathematical texts of Diophantus. The most likely of these are 2 student exercises, each of which asks for the solution to a pair of simultaneous quadratic equations. If you want to all see that, I have a copy of her little equations there. A brief sentence in Theon's commentary on Ptolemy's major work is seen by some as attributing authorship of the material to his daughter Hypatia. It indicates that an improved technique for long division was devised by Hypatia. Hypatia's father Theon had written a treatise on the astrolabe, or star taper. This astronomical instrument was used for measuring angles between stars or planets. It acted as an analog computer capable of working out problems in spherical astronomy. Hypatia's student, Synesius, claimed that he had designed an astrolabe with Hypatia's help and had it crafted by the best of silversmiths. In one of his 11 letters to Hypatia that still exist, Synesius asked Hypatia to make a hydroscope for him for some medical purpose during his illness. The hydroscope has been identified as a hydrometer. Why a sick man should require a hydrometer has invited speculation. The most plausible suggestions are that it was for use in the brewing or distillation of some alcohol-based medicine, or that it was intended for measuring the specific gravity of his urine. When Hypatia was 42 years old, engrossed in her teaching of philosophy and mathematics, Bishop Theophilus died, and his nephew Cyril of Alexandria became the new bishop. Proving even more intolerant and fanatical than his uncle, he was soon to direct his efforts against the living monuments of paganism, the scholars, the poets, and the philosophers. At the beginning of his reign, Cyril cast an envious eye at the wealth of the Novatians, an established Christian sect in the city. The Novatians were like Puritans. They were early-day Puritans, opposed to the ways of the Orthodox hierarchy. Gibbon describes them as the most innocent and harmless sectaries. Their doctrine was too intellectual to gain Cyril's support, and among the new bishop's first acts was the closure of Novatian churches, and the seizure of their sacred vessels and ornaments. Having purged the official Church of Alexandria of its dissenting minority, Cyril now led an attack that was even more violent than that of Theophilus on non-Christians, including both pagans and Jews. His first target was the Jews. This numerous community, he decided, should be expelled from the city, and the privileges which they had enjoyed for 700 years since the time of Alexander the Great, rescinded. The new bishop fomented attacks that resulted in the burning down of synagogues, again from Gibbon. Without any legal sentence, without any royal mandate, the patriarch at the dawn of day led a seditious multitude to the attack of the synagogues. Unarmed and unprepared, the Jews were incapable of resistance. Their houses of prayer were leveled to the ground. And the episcopal warrior, after rewarding his troops with the plunder of their goods, expelled from the city the remnant of the unbelieving nation. Thus did Alexandria lose a wealthy and industrious colony. Hubbard says, religious mania is the result of dwelling on a borrowed religion. If let alone, no man would become insane on religious topics, for the religion he would evolve would be one of joy, laughter, and love, not one of misery and horror. The religion that contemplates misery and woe and punishment is one devised by priestcraft for a purpose, and that purpose is to rule and rob. Over the issue of the expulsion of the Jews, Orestes, the Roman prefect or governor of the province of Egypt, whose role was to enforce secular laws, clashed with the militant Cyril. Orestes steadfastly resisted Cyril's agenda of ecclesiastical encroachment into secular prerogatives. According to Kenneth Humphreys, author of the article Death on the Nile, End of Classic Scholarship in Egypt, Orestes saw no sense in the attack on the Jews and the consequent civil commotion. Unable to overrule Bishop Cyril, Orestes complained to the child emperor, who was now Theodosius II. The bishop, he pleaded, was usurping the functions of the prefect's administration, but his appeal was in vain. The teenage Theodosius was completely under the dominating influence of his sister, the regent empress Aelia Pulcheria. When their father, the emperor Arcadius, died in 408, Theodosius II had been made emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire at 7 years of age. In 414, the 15-year-old Pulcheria proclaimed herself regent over her brother, then 13, and made herself empress of the Eastern Roman Empire. Pulcheria was a pious Christian who was waging her own campaign for Christ by turning the imperial palace into a virtual monastery. Far from censoring Cyril, the empress invested him with coercive power, effectively fusing church and state in the province of Egypt. In gratitude, Cyril likened her to the Blessed Virgin herself. In his struggle with Cyril, Orestes, nominally a Christian, had the backing of Hypatia, who had considerable moral authority in the city. Hypatia was the most popular person in the city. When she appeared in her chariot on the streets, people threw flowers at her, applauded her gifts, and cried, "Long live the daughter of Theon." Judging by the chronicles of the times, it appears that her beauty was as great as her modesty, and both were matched by her eloquence, and all three surpassed by her learning. Cyril persuaded himself that Hypatia's good name and talents were giving the cause of paganism a dangerous prestige, thereby preventing the progress of the new faith. As Mangasarian put it, Cyril argued in his mind that she was competing with Christianity, taking away from Christ the homage which belonged to him. With Hypatia out of the way, the people would turn to God and give him the love and honor which they were wasting upon her. She was robbing God of his rights, and she must fall. He is a jealous God. Such was the reasoning of Cyril, whom the church would eventually canonize. Although nominally a Christian, Orestes attended Hypatia's lectures at the Neoplatonist School of Philosophy. The anti-intellectual Cyril, who demonized traditional Alexandrian learning and science as perfidious paganism, accused Orestes of being under the spell of sorcery and the so-called Republic of Plato. Orestes' defense to these accusations was an appeal to the traditional policy of the Caesars, which had always been one of great leniency toward all schools of philosophy and all religions. But he spoke for a dying freedom. One day, several hundred of Cyril's followers, half-starved monks from the monasteries of Nitria, assaulted the prefect in his chariot, leaving him bloodied and angry. What is more, some Christians in Alexandria believe that Hypatia's influence had caused Orestes to reject all reconciliatory offerings by Cyril. Thus Hypatia attracted the hatred of those Christians who wanted the prefect and the bishop to reconcile. Mangasarian, in his Martyrdom of Hypatia, writes, "If we were living in those days, we would have witnessed at the close of each day, when both sea and sky blush with the departing kiss of the sun, Hypatia mounting her chariot to ride to the academy, where she is announced to speak on some philosophical subject. She is followed by many enthusiastic and devoted admirers, impatient to catch her eye. She is nodding to her friends on her right and on her left. She who refused lovers that she may love philosophy is not insensible to the appreciation of her pupils. A musical murmur sweeps over the audience as she rises to her feet. But in a moment all is silent again, save the throbbing and trembling of Hypatia's silvery voice. She speaks in Greek, the language of thought and beauty of the ancient world. Alas, this is her last appearance at the academy. Tomorrow that hall will be a tomb. When Hypatia's listeners bade her farewell on that evening, they did not know that within a few hours they would all become orphans. The next morning, when Hypatia appeared in her chariot in front of her residence, pardon me, suddenly 500 men, all dressed in black and cowled, half-starved monks from the sands of the Egyptian desert, monks like a black hurricane, swooped down the street, boarded her chariot, and pulling her off her seat, dragged her by the hair of her head into a church. Some historians intimate that the monks asked her to kiss the cross, to become a Christian and join the nunnery, if she wished her life spared. At any rate, these monks, under the leadership of Cyril's right-hand man, Peter the Reader, shamefully stripped her naked and scraped her quivering flesh from her bones with oyster shells. The mutilated body was then flung into the flames. Oh, is there a blacker deed in human annals? Excuse me. When has another man or woman been so inhumanely murdered? Even Joan of Arc was more fortunate in her death than this daughter of paganism. I wish I could live 1,000 years to admire the noble spirit and delight in the courage and beauty of this brave martyr of philosophy, Hypatia. Oh, that my voice were strong enough to reach the ends of the world. I would then summon all independent minds to join me in a hymn of praise to that incomparable woman. A distressed Orestes, officially still in charge of the province, ordered the execution of Hyrax, a Christian monk, for complicity in the murder. But within days, Orestes himself was forced to flee and is thought to have, later on, been murdered. Again from Magasarian. It was a classic world that was murdered in the person of one of its last and noblest representatives, Hypatia. Hypatia embodied in her life and teaching the proud spirit, the beauty, the culture, and the sanity of Greece. With her fell Greece, fell the intellectual world from her eminence. Then followed the nearly 10 centuries of darkness, which, settling over Europe, paralyzed all initiative. During the 1,000 years in which the spirit of St. Cyril and his church managed with undisputed sway the affairs of religion and state, night folded to its sterile bosom our orphaned humanity. And the chains of slavery were upon every mind. The barren and lumbering theology of the church crowded out the muses from their earthly walks, and the world became a prison. One by one, the great lights went out. Athens was no more. And as writer Elbert Hubbard said, with regard to the more general destruction by Christianity of classical learning and knowledge that was recurring and would continue to occur throughout Europe, dogmatism as a police system was supreme. It continued until the time of Dante or the Italian Renaissance. The reign of religious dogmatism was supreme for well nigh 1,000 years. We call it the Dark Ages. Several decades after Hypatia was murdered, Alexandria revolted against Constantinople and wound up with 2 factions contending between 2 patriarchs. In 686, the city fell to Arab conquerors who had the last of the library burned as fuel in the bathhouses of the city. The reign of religious dogmatism in Europe lasted almost 1,000 years. In the year 1493, when the Renaissance ushered in a new era, the first book brought out in Europe was the last book written in Alexandria by a pagan. It was the love poem of Hero and Leander. The struggle between theological dogmatism and scientific progress continues to our day, as we see political decisions being made on the basis of dogma rather than impartial and authoritative scientific studies. Hypatia stands out in history for her contributions to philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and pedagogy. In her independence of thought and the outspoken expression of her opinions, she was a forerunner of today's feminism, and she is becoming increasingly recognized. A number of books have been written about Hypatia, scholarly studies as well as novels and plays. Science has honored her by naming an asteroid, a lunar crater, and a genus of moth for her. She has been claimed by second-wave feminism, most prominently by Hypatia, a journal of feminist philosophy. In the art world, she has a place setting in Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party. Thank you. So we'll open. Lee?
I'd like to start by just applauding such a scholarly work. I applaud your work.
Thank you.
I'm touched.
To go back to the beginning, I had not realized that the Greek influence was so strong on Egypt in general.
I learned that too. I mean, I learned that too when I was doing the research too, because I hadn't known that either. But it was very, very, very strong. Thank you. Yes.
I'm sorry I have to leave, but I congratulate you, and I wonder if we can get a copy of this.
Sure.
Yes,
By the way, I am interested in the Dark Ages, so-called. I don't think they were Dark Ages. I think they were another phase of humanity. But I think this is wonderful. This is what we were all taught in school. Actually, your point.
Alice, I'd just like to say, I've been recording all of this. It will be on DVD and it will be available. You can have a copy.
DVD. Thank you. Sorry I have to leave.
First of all, I'd like to congratulate you, Alice, on your very scholarly presentation. Since I'm very interested in philosophy, I knew the outlines of the story of Hypatia, but I didn't know it in the detail in which you presented it, and it was very informative, and I thank you for that. Also wanted to say that the Hypatia situation did not begin the struggle between philosophy and religion. Centuries before, Socrates, the famous Athenian philosopher, was condemned to death for atheism and corrupting the youth. Those were the official charges against him. Then during the Middle Ages, with the Catholic Church in the dominant position, philosophy became the so-called handmaiden of theology. In other words, the philosophers were more or less required to just present arguments to justify the beliefs of the church, so it lost its independence. Then came the age of reason, the age of Voltaire and Hume and others, and the old animosity between the two re-emerged. And Hume himself was an atheist, for instance, and it's been true ever since. I can name off the top of my head 3 modern philosophers that were atheists: John Dewey, Bertrand Russell, and George Santayana. Not to mention the fact that in the 19th century, Karl Marx called religion the opium of the people. That was a well-chosen metaphor, in my opinion, for this reason. Both opium and religion temporarily relieve pain, but neither one solves any real problems.
Very good.
That's all I have to say.
I think, about Socrates, it's true, that he was persecuted for his teaching young people and so on. But I don't know if it's quite comparable to the persecution that happened under once the Christian religion had become part of the state.
I think that's correct.
Alice, you paint a far different picture of pagans than the picture that we've been taught. I thought that pagans were these people wearing a mask, bone in their nose, and are dancing around the fire. And this seems a little bit different. Thank you very much.
They were pagans. Paganism actually was the preserver of classical learning.
It was.
It was the means by which that was preserved. Yes, Joy.
I want to thank you for mentioning the dinner party, which was the first place where I learned about Hypatia. I have 2 books about the dinner party, and when I heard you were going to talk about Hypatia, I read what Judy had put about her in those books. And one of the things she said was that she was a child prodigy. And when she was even 4 years old, was very far advanced in her understanding of mathematics and so on. So if anybody wants to borrow these books, they're kind of falling apart, but I'm quite willing to loan them to anybody that wants to see about the 39 women on the table.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Judy.
I want to point out one quick thing too, since Fritz said something about pagans. We're getting ready to celebrate a holiday called St. Patrick's Day, which I don't celebrate because the story about St. Patrick's driving the snakes from Ireland is really a story about the Christians driving the pagans from Ireland. And at that time, the the knowledge and wisdom of paganism was held mostly by women and kept quiet within the home, and they literally killed